Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today, we're really getting into the world of Peter Thiel.
Yeah, he's one of those figures, isn't he? Hugely influential, but also, well, full of contradictions.
Exactly, co-founder of PayPal, early Facebook money, and the mind behind Palantir Technologies, the big surveillance firm.
That's the one. And our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is to really unpack his specific political idea, market libertarianism.
Right.
We're going through the sources you've given us, pulling out the key bits of knowledge to help you understand, the ideas, the business moves, the policies that make up his worldview.
And there's this tension right from the start, something I really want to get into. He uses all this libertarian free market language, but then you look at Palantir, critics say it's pretty authoritarian, using the state, using surveillance if it means, more efficiency technologically or economically.
It doesn't clash.
It really makes you pause, like, wait, what does freedom mean in his dictionary?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And it's a big step away from how people usually think about libertarianism. Thiel himself basically drew a line in the sand back in 2009.
Oh, yeah, that quote.
The famous one. I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. And that wasn't just a throwaway line.
No.
It was him saying, look, tech innovation, market efficiency, those come before democratic say-so.
So for you listening, what's the deal here? We're going to look at where these ideas even come from, some surprising roots.
See how they play out in the real world, different industries?
Weigh up the good and the bad, the pros and cons people see.
And try to figure out where this whole ideology even fits on the map, politically speaking.
Yeah, expect some things that might make you rethink a few assumptions. Okay, let's get started. Let's unpack this.
So, when we dig into the theory behind Thiel's market libertarianism, it's not like he just follows one school of thought.
No, it's more of a mix, right?
Exactly. He pulls together different strands, things that don't always seem like they'd go together, and makes this hybrid thing that's pretty unique.
Like Carl Schmitt. That's a name that often comes up, and it's, well, controversial.
Very. Schmitt was a German legal theorist, and Thiel directly references him in an essay from 2004, The Straussian Moment. He takes on Schmitt's ideas about sovereignty, about the friend-enemy thing.
And what's the core idea he takes from Schmitt? Because it sounds pretty intense.
It is. Thiel essentially argues that certain powerful people, maybe tech leaders, for example, should be able to operate outside the normal rules of democracy.
Outside the rule?
Yeah, he gets this from Schmitt's concept that the sovereign is he who decides on the exception, basically who gets to ignore the law in a crisis. For Thiel, innovators need that power, that freedom from slow, messy democracy.
Wow. Okay, that's a heavy concept. And then there's René Girard. That seems like a totally different direction. Mimetic theory.
Right. Girard's idea is that we often desire things just because other people desire them. It's imitation mimesis.
Like keeping up with the Joneses, but maybe more fundamental.
Kind of. And Girard thought this often leads to conflict, to destructive competition. Thiel reads this and thinks, aha, that's why direct competition is bad for business.
So instead of fighting over the existing market,
create a whole new market where there is no competition. Build a monopoly. It's the justification for why he prefers monopolies. He says it explicitly in his book, 0 to 1. Competition is bad. Aim for a creative monopoly through real innovation.
Which leads him to tweak the Austrian school economists, right? Like Hayek and Mises.
Exactly. He likes some of their ideas, the market focus, but he breaks with them on competition. They love competition, saw it as key.
But Thiel says,
hold on. Major technological breakthroughs can create good monopolies that are better than constant competition. Some people call it post-Austrian, thinking market-based, but anti-competition. A big shift from Hayek.
Okay, so all these different threads, Schmitt, Girard, a modified Austrian view, they all feed into his big idea, the monopoly thesis.
That's really central to market libertarianism, yeah. The core belief is that the best businesses should try to eliminate competition by being radically better, by innovating, not just by, cutting prices a bit.
He's challenging basic economics here and also standard libertarianism.
He is. His argument economically is pretty specific. He says perfect competition, the textbook ideal, drives profits down to zero.
Which means
no money left over, no real incentive for big, risky innovation or long-term investment. Monopolies, though, they can invest in R&D, pay people more, think longer term, because they aren't just fighting for survival day to day.
He sort of flips Schumpeter's creative destruction idea.
Kinda, yeah. Schumpeter saw new things destroying old industries. Thiel argues monopolies actually enable the creation of those new things in the first place. They aren't just victims of disruption.
And he argues these monopolies are actually good for society.
That's his claim. He says they create entirely new things, expanding the pie, not just fighting over slices. Think Google and search it. He'd see that as a creative monopoly, giving us something new, access to information, not just stealing ad dollars from newspapers.
That's the 0 to 1 idea from his book, creating something brand new versus 1 to N, which is just copying or scaling something that already exists, like another pizza place.
Exactly. And that directly challenges the standard economic view that maximum competition is always best for everyone.
This brings up a huge question, though, about political legitimacy.
Well,
if he's borrowing from Schmitt and kind of sidelining democracy.
right. His political theology, you could call it, definitely brings in Schmitt, but explicitly pushes back against democratic legitimacy as the basis for government. This is probably his biggest break from traditional libertarianism.
Which usually likes democracy as a check on state power.
Usually, yes. As a way to limit the state, ensure consent.
But Thiel, in that 2009 essay again, The Education of a Libertarian.
He basically says democratic politics just leads to bigger government because interest groups fight for stuff, the welfare state grows. He even, quite controversially, singled out groups like women and welfare recipients as being hard for libertarians to win over democratically.
Suggesting that more democracy actually works against his preferred market policies.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So his answer isn't let's fix democracy. It's more like let's find a way out.
A technological escape.
Yeah, through things like cyberspace, seasteading, building communities on the ocean, even space colonization. It's a move away from political battles towards creating new realms where politics, as we know it, doesn't apply. Innovation over participation.
And implicitly, this means governance by the people who can innovate, the tech elites.
It leans that way. It echoes Schmitt's idea of decisionism. Legitimacy comes from making effective decisions, not from popular consent.
Which you can see in how he talks about needing CEO-like leaders in politics, or his support for someone like Donald Trump who promised to shake up the old ways of governing.
Right.
So, if the goal is efficiency, CEO-style leadership bypassing democratic checks, where's the line? When does efficient leadership become, autocracy?
And that is the million-dollar question, the core worry for critics. But let's look at the practical side. How does this theory actually look as policy?
Yeah, what kind of rules or non-rules does market libertarianism actually propose?
You see some distinct patterns, especially economically. It's about boosting innovation and allowing market power to concentrate while still, talking the free market talk.
So antitrust laws, competition policy, he'd want those relaxed.
Generally, yes. The idea is that if a company dominates because it's genuinely better, more innovative, antitrust shouldn't stand in its way. He thinks traditional antitrust misses the point about how technology disrupts things dynamically.
Like Amazon moving into groceries or cloud computing, he sees that as good diversification, not crushing competition.
That would be the argument, yes. Creating new options for consumers.
What about patents, intellectual property? Some libertarians want less of that.
Thiel's different there. He strongly supports robust patent protection. Fits his monopoly idea. Give innovators a temporary monopoly so they have a strong incentive to invest in the first place. The benefits supposedly trickle down later.
And his venture capital work, like with Founders Fund, reflects this too.
Absolutely. They famously look for companies that could become monopolies, that aim to transform a whole market, create something entirely new. It's not just about spreading bets safely. It's about finding those potential 0 to 1 giants.
How does this translate to labor markets?
The focus is very much on human capital, on skills, on using technology. It's about educating workers to do high-value things in new industries.
Less focus on traditional unions or labor protections.
Much less. The emphasis is on individual skill development and adapting to technological change rather than collective bargaining within existing structures.
And for government itself, public administration.
Efficiency and expertise are prized over democratic processes. Critics call it techno-authoritarian. He likes applying business management principles, measure everything, hold people accountable for results.
That DOGE thing under Trump Department of Government Efficiency.
Exactly. That was an attempt to bring that kind of business thinking into government operations.
And lots of data, I assume, Palantir's whole business model.
Deeply data-driven, yes. Using sophisticated analytics, like Palantir provides, for making policy decisions. The promise is better, smarter decisions.
But the worry is
Privacy, definitely, and democratic oversight. When the government knows that much about everyone, based on data analysis, who's watching the watchers.
This also seems to fit with wanting stronger executive power in government, faster decisions.
Yes, it enables quicker action, less getting bogged down.
Yeah.
Again, echoes of Schmitt, the decider needs power. It does rub up against traditional American ideas about checks and balances, separation of powers.
And regulation in general.
The preference is for rules that focus on the final outcome, not prescribing exactly how to get there. The goal is to clear the path for innovation, remove hurdles.
Okay, so technology policy must be absolutely central here.
It's the core domain, really. Prioritizing tech development, sometimes over other concerns. Like with AI governance, the Thiel view would lean towards letting the private sector lead, minimal government rules, let competition sort out safety and capability.
Although he's fine with government using AI, like through Palantir contract.
Right, if it serves that efficiency goal. State involvement is okay when it's seen as useful for security or administration.
Which brings us back to surveillance. That seemed like the big contradiction for critics, supporting Palantir's massive surveillance tools.
It's a huge point of tension. It clashes directly with traditional libertarian concerns about privacy. Here, state efficiency and security clearly win out over individual privacy rights in his framework.
Then there's the escape stuff, space tech, colonization.
Yeah, his investments in companies like SpaceX fit that idea of technology providing alternatives to earthbound politics. Space becomes the ultimate frontier, free from existing rules.
And biotech, things like genetic engineering.
Similar pattern. Minimal regulation, prioritize individual choice, and pushing the boundaries of what's technologically possible, rather than focusing heavily on potential risks or ethical debates up front.
Moving on to education, social policy. It sounds like more market, less government.
Largely, yes. Individual choice, market mechanisms. His famous critique of universities, setting up the Thiel Fellowship to pay young people not to go to college.
Right, encouraging them to start businesses instead.
It shows a preference for practical skills, entrepreneurship, over traditional credentials.
And social safety nets, welfare.
The market libertarian approach favors private charity, market-based insurance over government programs. It's got that traditional libertarian skepticism about redistribution.
But interestingly, on some social issues, things like gay marriage or drug policy.
There, Thiel's view aligns more with social liberalism. Generally supports individual freedom in personal choices, which can put him at odds with traditional social conservatives.
Okay, so we've sketched out the ideas and the policies. Let's talk about the supposed upsides and then the pretty significant downsides people point to.
Sure. Looking at potential advantages, that monopoly thesis, well, there's an argument to be made. If companies aren't constantly fighting off competitors...
They have breathing room.
Exactly. Breathing room to invest in long-term fundamental research, maybe treat employees better, think about bigger societal things that firms in fierce competition might not be able to afford. People sometimes point to Google's research labs or high pay as examples.
And proponents would say this whole approach speeds up technological progress.
That's a key claim. Fewer regulations, allowing successful innovations to scale quickly. Think about how fast the internet, mobile tech, AI have developed. The argument is less red tape means faster breakthroughs, which ultimately benefits society.
Efficiency is another big claim, right? Economic efficiency.
Yeah, the idea is that if the best companies dominate, you avoid wasteful duplication. Instead of 10 companies all researching the same thing slightly differently, one dominant player can focus resources optimally.
And maybe these dominant tech players are just better at adapting quickly compared to slow government bureaucracy.
That's another part of the argument. They can pivot faster to changing conditions, unburdened by politics or legacy systems.
Okay, but, and it feels like a big but is coming.
It is. There are major criticisms, fundamental problems people see. The biggest one is probably the rejection of democratic accountability.
If you concentrate power in tech elites with no real oversight from the public.
The potential for abuse is massive, and people lose their say in how they're governed. Look at the concerns around Palantir's government work. Where's the transparency, the public input?
And the monopoly idea, while Thiel says it drives innovation, critics see
rent-seeking, exploitation. Once a company is dominant, it can potentially squeeze suppliers, exploit user data, charge higher prices without fear of competition. Think about criticisms of Facebook's data practices or Amazon's power over sellers.
Does this approach worsen inequality?
That's a major concern. Wealth and power get even more concentrated at the top among the tech winners, while safety nets for people left behind might shrink. The gains from tech might not be shared broadly.
And we keep coming back to surveillance.
It's critical. The embrace of mass surveillance via Palantir just fundamentally clashes with privacy principles for many people. Combine that surveillance power with monopoly market power. That's a recipe for potential social control, critics argue.
Is there also a risk that innovation gets skewed?
Yeah, the risk of innovation bias. Focusing only on what's profitable commercially while ignoring important public goods, basic science, environmental tech, public health, things that don't have an obvious, immediate market payoff.
So, putting all this together, this unique mix of ideas, where does it actually land on the political spectrum? It doesn't seem like a neat fit anywhere.
It really doesn't. If you compare it to traditional libertarianism, it's miles apart on key things.
Like,
While classic libertarianism is all about individual rights, keeping government small, protecting privacy, due process, Thiel's okay with massive surveillance and doesn't seem to trust democratic checks on power. That's why you hear terms like authoritarian libertarianism.
even compared to economic libertarians who love free markets.
Even there, most economic libertarians historically champion fierce competition. Think Rothbard or Nozick. Thiel's preference for monopoly turns that on its head. And the civil liberties angle is stark Palantir versus traditional libertarian privacy concerns.
What about neoliberalism? There seems to be some overlap there. Market focus, privatization.
There are overlaps, yes. Both like market solutions, less regulation in some areas. Thiel's push for government efficiency sounds quite neoliberal.
But the key difference is,
Democracy. Neoliberalism, for all its flaws, generally operates within and accepts democratic institutions and constitutions. Thiel seems willing to bypass them entirely. And again, neoliberals like Hayek loved competition. Thiel doesn't. He wants to use technology to transcend those institutional limits, not just reform them.
and compared to modern conservatism.
Some alignment, some clashes. He lines up with economic conservatives on lower spending, privatization, being pro-business. You saw that in his Trump connections.
That's socially.
He's more liberal on issues like marriage equality or drug policy than many traditional conservatives. And his whole embrace of radical tech disruption, his rejection of democratic norms, doesn't always sit well with conservative respect for tradition and institutions.
So it's really its own thing.
Pretty much.
Oh.
Scholars struggle to pin it down. You hear techno-libertarianism, neo-reactionary, post-libertarian. These are attempts to capture something that breaks the old left-right mold because it mixes elements in such an unusual way.
Let's look globally then. Are there real-world places or situations that kind of reflect this ideology?
There are interesting examples. Singapore often comes up.
How so?
Well, Singapore combines very market-friendly policies, low taxes, strong property rights, minimal business red tape, with quite authoritarian governance.
Right, elections exist, but there's strong executive power, limits on speech and assembly.
Exactly. And they actively use technology for governance, including surveillance. It ticks a lot of the market libertarian boxes: efficiency, state guidance of development, market orientation, but definitely not a liberal democracy.
That's a contemporary example. Any historical ones?
The experience of Chile under Pinochet in the 70s and 80s has some parallels, though it's obviously highly controversial.
The Chicago Boys implementing free market reforms.
Right. Widespread privatization, deregulation. It led to economic growth, but also huge inequality. And crucially, it happened under a military dictatorship that crushed dissent.
So market liberalization combined with authoritarianism, reflecting Thiel's point about freedom and democracy being potentially incompatible.
It seems to demonstrate that combination in practice. Though, importantly, Chile did transition back to democracy later and kept many of those market policies, suggesting maybe they can coexist despite Thiel's doubts.
And closer to home, Thiel's own involvement with the Trump administration?
That gives us concrete U.S. examples. You saw deregulation in many areas, which fits the market libertarian preference for freeing up business.
But crucially,
Government surveillance powers weren't cut back. If anything, they were maintained or expanded. That selective approach, less regulation for business, strong state security tools, is very market libertarian.
and specific tech policies.
Influence there too. Pushing for U.S. dominance in AI, lighter touch on privacy, more government use of surveillance tech, especially through Palantir contracts. And that DOGE initiative we mentioned, trying to run government more like a business.
In contrast, Europe seems to be pushing back against this model.
Very much so. The European Union's whole approach to big tech shows a strong democratic resistance. Think about their big regulations like the Digital Services Act or the AI Act.
Aimed at reining in tech power, setting rules for content, for AI use.
Exactly. Directly challenging Thiel's preference for minimal oversight. The EU prioritizes democratic accountability, individual rights, over pure market efficiency or innovation speed.
And GDPR, the data protection law.
A clear rejection of the surveillance-based business models that some of Thiel's ventures represent. Europe consistently puts privacy ahead of market efficiency in these debates. Their antitrust actions against U.S. tech giants also show a fundamentally different view on monopolies.
So, given all this, how does Thiel continue to wield influence today? It seems quite significant.
It is. A big part is the network often called the PayPal Mafia.
Right, all those early PayPal people who went on to found or fund other huge tech companies.
And increasingly getting involved in politics. People like J.D. Vance, David Sachs, associated with the Trump orbit. It's a powerful network.
And his investment funds, like Founders Fund. It's not just about making money, is it?
It seems strategic, directing capital towards companies and founders who not only have potentially disruptive ideas, but might also share aspects of this market libertarian outlook. It shapes the whole tech ecosystem.
They also promote the ideas themselves.
Definitely. Through media, funding policy groups, think tanks, even influencing academia, building an intellectual infrastructure. Plus, his past roles, like on Facebook's board, gave influence over information flow, platform rules.
And Palantir itself gives him global reach.
Absolutely. Its contracts with governments worldwide essentially export that model of surveillance and data analysis. His investments in defense tech, like Anduril, shape security policy too, and his backing of U.S. AI against Chinese rivals highlights the geopolitical angle.
How do academics view all this? Democratic theorists.
They see fundamental problems.
Yeah.
Democratic legitimacy rests on participation, elections, things Thiel downplays or rejects. From a substantive democracy view, one that values equality, real citizen power. These policies are seen as undermining democracy by concentrating power and wealth.
What about legal scholars? Constitutional issues?
They raise flags too. Things like due process, equal protection, limits on government power. Palantir's surveillance activities, for instance, are often questioned under Fourth Amendment search and seizure protections and basic privacy rights.
And economists? Do they buy the monopoly thesis?
Mainstream economics is generally skeptical. The standard view is that monopolies usually harm consumers through higher prices, lower quality, and can actually stifle innovation in the long run due to lack of pressure. Competitive markets, regulated appropriately, are often seen as better for overall welfare and innovation.
So public research plus competition might be better than just letting monopolies run wild.
That's often the finding, yes. They can complement each other.
And looking at it through a lens of power and class.
Critics argue market libertarianism clearly benefits the elite, the owners of capital, the tech leaders, while weakening labor and collective power. It can lead to a captured state where government serves private interests, like the close ties between Palantir and intelligence agencies suggest, and globally, it can help capital move freely while undermining national democratic control and social safety nets.
Okay, wow. We have covered a lot of ground today, really trying to unpack Peter Thiel's very complex, sometimes contradictory idea of market libertarianism.
Yeah, to sort of sum up, it really is a unique and, influential ideology. It doesn't fit the old labels. We've seen that core contradiction again and again. Market talk mixed with authoritarian governance.
Tech innovation hand in hand with more surveillance.
Libertarian language used to argue for concentrated power. It's definitely something new, ideologically speaking, and something we need to pay attention to.
And the impact isn't just theoretical. These policies, whether they come through Palantir, the PayPal network, his political spending, they have real potential consequences for you, for society. Potential for big innovation, yes, but also, and this is critical, potential to erode democratic foundations.
Right. Market libertarianism might speed up tech progress, might make certain things more efficient, but it does so by potentially threatening basic democratic values, accountability, equality, individual freedom.
It really throws that core tension into sharp relief, doesn't it? The tension between what technology can do and how we govern ourselves democratically.
Thiel's ideology forces us right up against that question. Can these two things truly coexist peacefully?
So where does that leave us? What's a possible path forward? Our dive today suggests that, well, pure market libertarianism probably isn't compatible with democracy as we value it.
Seems unlikely.
But maybe there are specific bits.
Yeah.
Certain policies, maybe around streamlining some regulations that could be adopted carefully within strong democratic guardrails to foster innovation without sacrificing democracy.
That's the incredibly difficult balancing act. Figuring out which specific parts might be useful and which are fundamentally dangerous to democratic society, and how to implement anything safely.
It really leaves us with a big question, something for you to think about after listening. In this world of incredibly powerful technology, growing connectivity, concentrated wealth, and sophisticated surveillance tools, how do democratic societies hold on to real popular control?
How do we protect individual liberties? What kind of institutions, what kind of wisdom do we need to navigate this? Especially now in the digital age, where
Yeah.
power can concentrate so quickly and subtly.
Definitely food for thought. And that wraps up this deep dive. We hope this gave you a much clearer picture of Peter Thiel's unique vision and its really profound implications.
Until next time.